Welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar series. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center and your host. We missed you during the Martin Luther King holiday and the inaugural hiatus. You appear to have missed us as well because we have an excellent audience today, much of which I attribute to our guest, author and presidential historian, Tevi Troy. Before we go to today's program, I want to remind everybody that this is Holocaust Memorial Day. This year's remembrance, I think, is oddly positive. I've been watching the number of Arab countries and individuals joining the conversation, and it is so far from some previous positions by some people that maybe the world actually has progressed. I hope so. Before our program, we have two commercials, first for the JPC and second for two books that you really should read. And since most of you are still not spending a lot of time commuting in your cars to an office, you probably could use some additional reading material. So first, the JPC commercial. We were established in 1985 as a 501c3, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policy. You can find our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. You can read our Insight articles, In Focus magazine, or In Context blog, or you can see our Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense blogs with lots of good information about US and Israeli defense policy and cooperation between them. We support a strong American defense policy, US-Israel security cooperation and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As a small organization that sits slightly to the right of center, we also support small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, and free speech and intellectual diversity. That last one is probably highest on our list right now. In this series of calls, we've been pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China in various permutations, Israel issues, including but not only the Abraham Accords, Iran sanction, and the sort of rolling rebellion in Iran, with a side trip to talk about the US Supreme Court and America's long wars. Today, we're going slightly esoteric. We will be discussing American presidential history and the US-Israel matrix fitting in there. But before that, your second commercial as I introduce our speaker. The first book for your edification is Tevi Troy's Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management. I wrote once that the title is a little bit of a fraud because at the end of the day, it's not really about presidents and it's not really about disasters. It's about you and me and us and how we relate to crises as individuals. Tevi's own conclusion is, I quote from the book, individuals have a tough job. Although many Americans do know what to do in terms of crisis, millions more do not. If disaster strikes, we all have to keep ourselves, our families, and our loved ones going without staff, without a massive bureaucracy, without an army, just ourselves. It is resilience coupled with smart preparation that will get us through. And I think there are no better words for the pandemic as it enters its first anniversary. So do that one, and then do the current book, which is called Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump, which is about White House staff and its role in public policy. It should be noted that the idea of a professional White House staff was generated in 1936 by a committee dealing with the administrative needs of FDR's New Deal. The president, I quote, needs help, the committee concluded. They suggested 6, just 6 executive assistants who would, quote, remain in the background, issue no orders, make no decisions, and emit no public statements. They would be, according to the committee, possessed of high competence and a passion for anonymity. So anybody who knows anything about the government knows that when the idealistic picture met the reality of Washington egos, presidential and otherwise, it was doomed. And it's a great, great story of modern American history and how it went. These are important books. These are timely books. These are great books, and they're really fun. So Shall We Wake the President and Fight House. Now, our author and today's guest, Tevi Troy, is founder and president of the American Health Policy Institute and previously served as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. As deputy secretary of Health and Human Services during the George W. Bush administration, he led the largest civilian government department in the federal government, overseeing Medicare, Medicaid, food and drug safety, disease prevention, and other government programs. He also served as deputy assistant and then acting assistant to the president for domestic policy and as the White House Jewish liaison. He is a graduate of Cornell University and has an MA and PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas at Austin. And most important, from our point of view, Tevi is a member of the Jewish Policy Center Board of Fellows. Before I give him the floor, your public service announcement, questions are welcome. Use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We love questions. Go for it. And now, Tevi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana, for that nice introduction, for having me today, and also for those really kind words about my books. When you were reading the words from Shall We Wake the President about individuals and how they need to be prepared for disaster, I mean, they're words I wrote, but I had not written them, and I wrote them more than 6 years ago, and they're kind of chilling now in the context of the coronavirus pandemic and how everybody really needs to be prepared for themselves. And I thought when I wrote the book that people would need to be prepared for themselves and have to take care of themselves if a disaster happened. And now we've seen that I was right. And this whole idea of individual preparedness is so important. I also appreciate your kind words about Fight House and your nice reviews of both books. And today I'm going to talk about, as a Democrat enters the White House, the Joe Biden administration begins, what was the history of Democrats with previous administrations on the issue of Israel. This is based in part on the book Fight House, which I conveniently have here. And I also distilled this in an article in Commentary. I mean, I know that JPC is a nonpartisan entity. I also wrote a piece a couple years ago for Commentary on what Republicans do on Israel when they're in the White House. So because we're entering the Biden administration, that's why I'm going to talk about Democrats today. But should Republicans win in 2024, which I know you can't make a comment on because you're nonpartisan, but I personally would be rooting for. If Republicans win in 2024, I'd be happy to do a webinar like this on Republicans and Israel in 2025. But for now, we're going to talk about the Democrats and what we could perhaps learn from previous administrations about what might happen in this administration. And the premise of my article and my distillation from Fight House about Democrats in the White House is, my book is about fighting in the White House. And there's always fighting in the White House, and people, especially in the Trump administration, kind of wrung their hands and say, oh, that was terrible. There was all this fighting. Isn't it awful? It's unprecedented. And what I did in Fight House was to look back at the history and see that, no, actually, it's not unprecedented. There's always fighting in the White House to some degree. And I found that fighting was disproportionately on the Israel issue. So administrations fight a lot, but they often fight on Israel. But another thing I found is that while people wring their hands and say fighting is terrible, it may not be terrible for Israel if a Democrat's in the White House if there's fighting. And what do I mean by that? If there's unanimity on the Israel issue in a Democratic administration, it could very well be bad unanimity that's not supportive of Israel. And it is the actual fighting that brings the other perspectives to bear, that shows that there are other points of view on Israel and that could actually be helpful to Israel. And let me show you what I mean by that. Let's go back to the beginning of my book and the beginning of the State of Israel, which is in the Harry Truman administration. Truman is president. This is, I know we're at Holocaust Remembrance Day, and in the shadow of the Holocaust, Israel was founded. And there was an open question, kind of unbelievable to me even to say these words today, but there was an open question about whether the United States of America would recognize the State of Israel. And the United States national security establishment was almost unanimously opposed to this idea of recognizing Israel. Leading the national security establishment in this opposition to recognizing Israel was Secretary of State George Marshall. Marshall was one of the generals who helped win World War II. He was the person who Truman revered more than anyone else in public life, and he was the sitting and very powerful Secretary of State. He did not think the US should recognize Israel. He thought that the Arabs were likely to win any conflict. He thought that the Arabs had oil, they had more population. There was no point in backing this ragtag group of Jews. But Truman wasn't so sure, and he wanted to hear a different perspective. And he set up a meeting in the White House where they would air this issue out. And the person who was assigned to make the case for Israel was a guy named Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford later became famous. He later became defense secretary. He later got embroiled in a foreign banking scandal. But this is all in the future. At the time, Clark Clifford was a relatively junior White House aide, went to Washington University of St. Louis, had a law degree, was a trained attorney. And when he was given this assignment of defending Israel or making the case for Israel, he took the assignment like a trial attorney and he made a brief for recognizing Israel. Now, I would say that Marshall was a little bit arrogant. He thought he has the whole national security establishment behind him. He's George Marshall. He kind of goes in there saying he'll just say it and that's enough. But Clifford marshaled arguments and facts and he was ready to go. And he actually kind of flummoxed Marshall, who sniffily looked at him and said, "What's Clifford doing here?" Meaning Clifford is a domestic policy aide, is involved in the grubby side of politics, but I am George Marshall. But Truman backed up Clifford and said, "Well, General, he's here because I asked him to be here." And Clifford makes this great case for recognizing Israel. He wins the day. Truman does recognize Israel, although he did say to Clifford after the meeting, "Whoa, that was rough as a cob," which is kind of Truman's Missouri language for that was a really tough meeting. And Israel is recognized by the US, is a great ally of the US to this day, and I hope will continue to be an ally for many more years. But Clifford, while he was successful, was definitely placed in Marshall's crosshairs after that, because Marshall never again spoke to Clifford or uttered his name for the rest of his life. So he really knew how to carry a grudge. But the point is that here you had an administration where if there had not been any fighting, any disagreement, any butting heads, the prevailing view would have been that of George Marshall, and Israel would not have been recognized. So I think from the very early days, you have this example of having some kind of infighting, some internal conflict was actually beneficial to Israel and the Democratic administration. Let's fast forward a little bit to the next time Israel was threatened at a war in a Democratic administration, and that was in the Johnson administration when the Six-Day War is happening. Once again, the national security establishment is not on the side of Israel. They're very skeptical of Israel. They prevail on Johnson to pressure Israel to demand that Israel not strike first. Israel, as we all know, did not listen, and faced with this existential threat, did strike first and won this resounding victory. But there were some White House aides, some of them Jewish, but not all, but the kind of political White House aides, the guys you think about from West Wing, for example, those people were generally pro-Israel in this conflict. And a guy named Ben Wattenberg, who was actually my mentor, the first guy I worked for when I moved to Washington, as well as another guy named Larry Levinson, were writing memos to Johnson about how he was hurting himself in the Jewish community when his press secretary said that Israel, we will be neutral in word and deed on the question of Israel. And they wrote this memo to Johnson making the case for being more robust in favor of Israel. Now, Johnson didn't necessarily want to hear from them, and he kind of yelled at Levinson, "You and Wattenberg are Zionist dupes, you're Zionist dupes." But he got the message, and he was a little less harsh on Israel throughout the conflict and as the conflict progressed. And also, importantly, there was this terrible incident where the Israeli Navy sank a US ship called the Liberty. And the Israelis claimed that it was a mistake. The conflict was going on. This was in Israeli territorial waters. The US military establishment did not believe it was a mistake and rejected the idea it was a mistake. But Johnson kind of overruled them and said, "Let's take Israel's perspective and let's give Israel the benefit of the doubt on this," and they indeed did so. So again, having some internal conflict, having people push back against anti-Israel views in a Democratic administration is a helpful thing. Now, in the Carter administration, we unfortunately got to this unanimity perspective a little bit more. Carter administration was famously riven by conflict. The two top people on foreign policy were Zbig Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor, and Cy Vance, who was the Secretary of State. They fought on absolutely every issue, on the Soviets, on Iran, on European issues, everything. They fought about everything except one. They were united in their skepticism of Israel, and Carter joined them in it. And Israel, as a result, faced a pretty difficult experience in the Carter administration. In fact, Simcha Dinitz, who was the Israeli ambassador to Washington, even said to Stu Eisenstadt, who was a domestic policy aide, Jewish, and also someone who argued in favor of Israel within the administration, although he was on the domestic policy side, Dinitz said to Eisenstadt, "Can you please change Carter's perspective on Israel? He is dealing with an ally." You had to tell the president of the United States that dealing with Israel is dealing with an ally. So it's a little frightening the way the Carter administration viewed Israel. And in fact, Menachem Begin was reluctant to go to Camp David because he feared that Carter would side all the time with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. And one of the chroniclers of the 13 days at Camp David, someone who, Lawrence Wright, who's no fan of Israel, but he said, when discussing Begin's fear, he said Begin was right to be worried. And Carter did indeed side mostly with Sadat. Fortunately, the end result was that we did have this peace treaty with Egypt, between Israel and Egypt, that has lasted for 40 years, and Israel has never had a conflict with a standing army since that deal was signed. So that's a good thing. But still, the Carter administration was indeed a rough patch for Israel. Now, if we fast forward a little bit to the Clinton administration, here you have an administration where I'd say there was, again, unanimity, and Dennis Ross, who I think speaks pretty smartly about these issues, says that there was very little tactical disagreement within the Carter administration, within the Clinton administration. But what did that agreement mean? It generally meant that they were very supportive of Yitzhak Rabin and worked very closely with him, and Clinton personally felt very close to Rabin. But after Rabin was tragically assassinated and there's an election and Netanyahu wins, they were also unanimous in their opposition to Bibi Netanyahu. And there was a lot of talk, if you look at the oral histories and the archives, just how difficult they thought Netanyahu was and how opposed they were to Netanyahu. And Clinton even has some of his political aides try and defeat Netanyahu in the election. So again, you have unanimity. It's not necessarily pro-Israel. I would say that Clinton passes what they call the Kishka's test, which is a test of somebody who's kind of pro-Israel at an innate level or at a kind of inherent level. But that said, there was definitely a lot of pushback and butting heads against Netanyahu. And I think there was a little more comfort with it because there was a sense that Clinton had passed the Kishka's test, but still Netanyahu definitely had a rough go with the Clinton administration. Now, if we move to the Obama administration, you have a similar dynamic in that Netanyahu is once again prime minister, and once again the Democratic administration is very hostile to him and not such a big fan of his. But here you've got a president in Obama who doesn't necessarily pass the Kishka's test. And again, here we have an administration where there's relatively little infighting on Israel, but there's relatively little positive feeling about Israel as well. And the lead architect of the Israel policy was a guy named Ben Rhodes, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor. And Rhodes admits in his own memoir that his nickname within the White House was Hamas. How did he get this nickname? He gives an example of the usage of the nickname. Rahm Emanuel, who's the chief of staff and a little more pro-Israel than Rhodes, he used to say, Hamas here wants to make it so I can't go to my effing kid's bar mitzvah in effing Jerusalem. Rahm Emanuel is famously quite profane. But the idea that somebody would be nicknamed Hamas, the name of a murderous terrorist organization, and admit that his nickname was Hamas, and even put it in his own memoir. I mean, if God forbid I was ever nicknamed Hamas, I certainly wouldn't put it in my memoir. I tried to bury it as best I could. But Rhodes and Obama famously shared what everybody called a mind meld. They were very closely aligned on the Israel issue. And I would say that Israel did have a bit of a rough go in the in the Obama administration. So now we're at 4 years later, we're at the cusp of the Biden administration. Fortunately, Ben Rhodes is not in the administration. Also, Susan Rice, who was pretty hostile to Israel, is in this administration, but not in a foreign policy role, which I think is a good thing. And Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Ron Klain, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and the Chief of Staff, are not necessarily known as hostile to Israel. Also, Biden has a more positive view of Israel based on his history. So we may be in another situation, kind of like the Clinton administration, where Biden is somebody who would be seen by the Jewish community as someone who kind of passes the Kishka's test, meaning somebody who does not have an innate hostility to Israel and may even have an innate like for Israel, but not necessarily a fan of Netanyahu and expects some butting heads, not within the administration on the issue so much as butting heads between Netanyahu and the Biden administration. And with that, I'll stop and take whatever questions you may have for me.
Thank you. No, I wouldn't want to be called Hamas either.
Who would? Besides Ben Rhodes.
I don't know. Well, I mean, somebody who thinks that it's funny. I don't know. Some people have a strange sense of humor. We do have some questions, and thank you for offering to come back and do, the other side of the balance table if it happens. But here is a question from a listener.
When it happens.
Do Democratic administrations encourage more dissension than Republican administrations? Or is it simply a matter of the personality of the president at whatever time?
Yeah, it has not been my experience or the result of my research that Democratic administrations are more likely to fight or that Republican administrations are more likely to fight. There is some sense that there's three factors involved in infighting that I kind of quantified this in Fight House. Number one is ideological disagreement leads to more infighting. So the more ideologically aligned an administration is, and it could be on the left for a Democrat or on the right for a Republican, the more ideologically aligned, the less infighting. The second is process is very important. If you've got a chief of staff who runs things in a clear, clean way, where everybody knows their roles, everybody stays in their lane, you're going to have less infighting. Carter, for example, famously didn't want a chief of staff, and I think that led to a lot of dysfunction. Obama, however, had a very tight process. So process is the second factor. And the third factor is presidential tolerance for it. If you have a president who says, I'm fine with fighting, fight it out, let's see what happens, which Trump kind of did. He said, I like conflict at one point. There's also a great story about Trump that he's on Trump Force One. This is back during the campaign. And he is sitting there flanked by AJ Delgado, who's a press aide, and Hope Hicks, who's a communications aide, both female, and they're flanking him and yelling at each other. Trump is sitting there reading the New York Times. I know he claims he doesn't read it, but he would read it all the time. And he's sitting there, they're fighting over his head. He puts down his newspaper and he says, "Cat fight," and then he lifts the paper back up again. Now that is a president who's okay with conflict in his vicinity. Obama, in contrast, would say, I don't want to see this stuff. He had this no drama Obama ethic. He would call people out on the carpet if they were seen to be fighting too much. So different presidents have different levels of tolerance for it. It doesn't make it a better administration or worse administration. It doesn't make the policy better or worse, but it does help control the level of infighting if that's what you want. Now, I will just give one caveat or warning on this. In the Johnson administration, Johnson famously didn't want conflict. He wanted everybody on the same page, which was the Johnson page. He didn't want disagreement. He didn't brook disagreement. And that led to really negative consequences with respect to the Vietnam War, because people felt like they couldn't talk openly about what was happening. And in fact, there was even a group of aides at the State Department that was concerned about what was going on and felt that Vietnam was not going well. But they felt they couldn't even form a little organization to discuss it. They called their little group the NonGroup, and they met in private secret sessions so that Johnson wouldn't find out about it. If you have that kind of level of control and limitation of debate, you may have less infighting that shows up in the paper, but you also may get worse policy results.
You mentioned a question from a reader. You mentioned Lyndon Johnson, and people said to him during the war that it could cost him support in the Jewish community. How strong a plank is that in an argument? Are all these guys weighing Jewish votes? Are they not weighing Jewish votes, but thinking, what am I going to do for my country? How the questioner wants to know how strongly important it is to a president.
Yeah, so there's a number of factors here, and I've written and worked on this issue extensively. So it used to be that the Jewish vote mattered more because the Jewish vote in certain states that were at the time swing states was a higher percentage. So the percentage of Jews in New York State was higher at one point than it is now, and New York was a swing state. Now Jews are, there's still a lot of Jews in New York State, but it's a couple of million out of a population of 20 plus million. Plus, you also have a situation where New York is hardcore blue. It does not appear to be going red anytime in the near future. So in some ways, the Jewish vote matters a little bit less. That said, when I was at the White House and later when I worked on the Bush campaign, we were concerned about the Jewish vote in presidential politics, just not the Jewish vote in New York, Illinois, California. We didn't care about those states because those states were going to be blue no matter what. So we looked at the Jewish vote in purple states that had a couple of points of Jews, meaning a couple of percentage, 1 or 2 or 3% Jews in the state. And we had a rule of thumb that because Jews vote in disproportionate numbers, you can almost double the percentage of Jews to determine what the percentage of Jews were in the electorate of that state. And so that meant we cared about the Jewish vote in Ohio and in Florida and in Minnesota and in Michigan and we looked in Arizona. So we looked at those states and really tried to focus on the Jewish communities in those states. So the Jewish vote can matter. The other thing that's really important is you saw Trump do many steps that were very pro-Israel, move the embassy. He was not doing any of those things because he cared about the relatively small percentage of the Jewish population that was supportive of him. Obviously, the Orthodox community was much more supportive of Trump than the Reform and the conservative components. But even so, he wasn't doing things that were pro-Israel for the possibility that Reform or conservative Jews were going to vote for him, because they weren't, or the possibility that Orthodox Jews were going to really swing an election. He was doing it because the evangelical community is so supportive of Israel, which I think is a good thing. I know some people think that's a scary thing. I think it's good that the most important voter segment in one of the two major parties in this country is very, very pro-Israel and is going to make sure that that party stays pro-Israel. But it's important to remember that the things that Trump was doing, and other presidents as well, but Trump, I think, more nakedly, the things that Republican presidents do in favor of Israel, they do it A, because they think it's right, but B, because they know their biggest block of voters, the evangelical voters, are supportive of Israel in a very strong way.
So here's a question from, from a listener, and I'm going to expand the question a little bit. Her question is, how do you square President Obama's hostility to Israel and Netanyahu, excuse me, with his claims to be the, quote, first Jewish president and celebration of Passover, etc.? I'm going to expand that to ask the question not only of Obama, but is there a difference between pro-Jewish sentiment and pro-Israel sentiment among the presidents that you've looked at? So is it possible that President Obama really saw himself as pro-Jewish, even though he clearly had problems with the state of Israel and its duly elected democratic leadership?
To the listener's very good question of how do you square Obama's hostility to Israel with his claims to be the first Jewish president, I'm tempted to give a two-word answer, which is I can't. But
okay,
but that's not what you're looking for, and that wouldn't be fair to the questioner. The truth is that Obama was unique in that he did not grow up in the mainland U.S. He grew up in Hawaii and in Indonesia, and in both those environments, he was not exposed to a lot of Jews or a lot of pro-Israel sentiment. Later, when he grows up, he moves to pretty liberal American cities, namely New York and Chicago. And the Jews that he encounters there, especially in Chicago, are extremely liberal, very secular American Jews who have this skeptical view of Israel. And he saw himself as very close to many of those very identifiable Jews. I mean, people who saw themselves as identifiably Jewish, but people who were, again, skeptical of Israel and were more in the dovish camp, I would say. And so he squares it by saying, well, look, my friend, this guy from Chicago and that guy from New York, they're Jewish, they eat lox and bagels, but they also hate Netanyahu just like I do. And that is how he squared it in my mind. That's my general thought on it. In general, I think that I think for the most part, if you're pro-Israel, you're generally pretty philo-Semitic. Maybe exception might be Richard Nixon, who would say some terrible things about Jews on the White House tapes, but came through for Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War with Operation Nickel Glass, where he helped bring arms to Israel at a time when Israel really needed it. I would say that Jimmy Carter was pretty hostile to Israel, although he had some very close Jewish aides, including Stu Eisenstadt, whom I've mentioned. But I don't really get the warm and fuzzy feelings about Carter and Jews. That's my own personal feeling about it. But for the most part, I would say that you can see some link between the feelings of closeness towards Israel and positivity towards Jews. But the exceptions and the ones that I just explained, I think are also interesting to look at.
Thank you. Question. As far as arms sales and arms sales and technology transfers to Israel, do you see any important differences between Democratic and Republican White Houses?
I wouldn't make it between Republican and Democratic White Houses so much as more supportive and less supportive of Israel White Houses. And again, this is in the, let's call it the modern era. Right before Kennedy, there was really no arms sales to Israel, and it's really under Johnson that arms sales to Israel became. America became Israel's #1 arms sales destination because the French bailed on Israel after the '67 war, and then also it's under Carter that you kind of have this. The aid to Israel becomes an annual event in Congress. So let's talk about in this modern era. And I think what you find on this issue is that administrations that are a little more skeptical of Israel or questioning of Israel might try to make aid to Israel contingent on certain behavior. And again, that's not linked to Democrats or Republicans, because you saw this with the George H.W. Bush administration and the issue of, it's not arms sales, but it's of the housing subsidies, the loan guarantees for Russian immigrants who were flooding into Israel at the time. So I think, again, both parties seem to be supportive of arms to Israel, but I think the people who are more skeptical of Israel, and these days Democrats are more skeptical of Israel, might be more inclined to link those arms sales to hoped for behavioral changes by Israel.
Michael Rubinoff at Arizona State University says hello to you.
Hi.
And he follows on the question about more and less and having to do with Israel. Do you think that certain administrations, including Carter and Obama, are less supportive of Israel owing to their hostility for nationalist-oriented states, that it's a state problem, not a Jewish problem, not even an Israeli person problem? It seems as if he says, it seems as if anti-nationalist ideology drove US policies.
It's a great question, and Michael's a super smart guy and someone I enjoy learning from very much. There's something going on with the left in Israel. I don't know if it's nationalism. I don't know if there's some kind of latent anti-Semitism. There's something going on. And in fact, Todd Gitlin, who is a big lefty who was involved in the protest movements in the 60s, was quoted in the New York Times this week saying that hostility to Israel has become an orthodoxy among leftist elements on campus. And I don't think that there is a rational explanation for it. Michael's idea about making it nationalist, anti-nationalist is interesting. But there are other nationalist states that the left doesn't hate as much as Israel. And it just seems like Israel has a special form of hostility. I know Natan Sharansky has written about this. If you treat Israel in different ways than you treat other countries, if you have a special hostility towards Israel, you think about it, you might be an anti-Semite. I mean, he has a very interesting way of kind of laying out the case where hostility to Israel goes over a certain line. And that leads to hostility. But I really don't see a rational reason behind the level of hostility to Israel that you get from the left. Nationalism is interesting, but I don't think it explains it all. Maybe some latent anti-Semitism explains some of it, but not all of it. The fact that conservatives like Israel these days, I think, is part of it. But this hostility to Israel was starting to emerge even before Republicans became the go-to party for Israel. So I think there's a lot of factors at play here.
So now we have a history question, and people can't not ask the sort of Republican question. So let's go to the historical Republican question first. Could you comment on the influence of Kissinger on Nixon with regard to Israel? How'd that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, Kissinger, we think of him as this kind of wizened Buddha who sits on TV with a Germanic accent and makes these smart foreign policy pronouncements. When you think about Kissinger back in 1969 when he's joining the Nixon administration, he was a thin-skinned, young, not sure of himself, although very smart, sharp-elbowed bureaucratic player. And he got in terrible fights with Secretary of State William Rogers, who was Secretary of State in the Nixon administration, and he was constantly involved in all kinds of fights in the Nixon administration. And he managed to assert himself in almost all areas of foreign policy. But interestingly, in the early days of the Nixon administration, Kissinger did not have sway over Israel policy because of his Jewishness. Nixon said, well, you know, this guy's Jewish, let's not give him the Israel portfolio. And in fact, I even have a story in White House. There's a White House meeting where Kissinger does weigh in and makes a point about Israel. And Nixon cuttingly says, let's hear the American point of view now, Henry. So pretty harsh, right? I mean, you're even covering your mouth, Shoshana. So I think there was some just weirdness in general between Nixon and Kissinger. He liked that Kissinger was so smart and his foreign policy guru and a brilliant strategist, but he also liked to torture him over his Jewishness and his Germanic accent as well. So I think that's the backdrop for what I want to say on this. And I would say that Kissinger took pains not to be seen as overly pro-Israel in the administration. In fact, I mentioned earlier Operation Nickel Glass grasp where they were bringing the arms to Israel. Kissinger was opposed to that, and it was Nixon who was in favor of it. And then later, when he got some pushback and said, well, maybe we should just send a limited amount of arms to Israel, Nixon said, send it all. They're going to criticize us if it's a literal lot. Send it all so it actually has an impact. So Nixon was the more pro-Israel player there. And in fact, there's a great story that at one point when Israel, after the initial losses in that horrible 73 war, is on the offensive, and they're pushing back against the Egyptians, and they actually surround the Egyptian Third Army, cut it off, and have the potential to destroy it. Kissinger doesn't want them to do that because he fears the Soviets will get involved, and he also has this grand strategy about how to push the Soviets out of the Middle East, which, by the way, he was successful with, and the Soviets left the Middle East for almost 40 years until Obama let them back in. But so Kissinger is pushing against Israel's advances on the Third Army, and he says to Dinitz, Simcha Dinitz, who I mentioned earlier, who is the Israeli ambassador to Washington in the 70s, she says, Jesus Christ, don't you understand how important this is? And Dinitz pauses and says, perhaps we would understand a little better if you cited a different prophet. Which is extra funny given that Kissinger was Jewish as well. So yeah, I think Kissinger had a complicated relationship with Israel.
Could you do the same for Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, please, and their views on Israel? We have a question.
Yeah, less happy to do that one because there was just a lot of hostility. Abba Eban, who was the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., both the U.S. and to the UN in the 1950s, said that America had a lot to recommend it, but the views of its policymakers towards Israel was not one of those things. And he talked about the hostility. And in fact, Abba Eban kind of invented the go-to move of pro-Israel advocates these days, which is go to Congress when the administration's hostile. And he did that both in the Truman administration, which, as I said, there was some hostility from the State Department, but also in the Eisenhower administration. And there was a lot of skepticism in the Eisenhower administration towards Israel. We all, or many of us, know about the 1956 incident where Israel, in the Suez Crisis, takes over the Sinai for the first time, and Eisenhower is irate and forces them to give it back. But Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles just were of that national security view at the time, which is the Arabs have the oil, the Arabs have the numbers, and Israel is kind of this upstart state. It didn't help that Israel had its socialist origins, and they weren't quite sure whether Israel was helpful in the Cold War or not. This really changes, by the way, in the 73 war, when Israel defeats the Soviet-armed Arab armies and gives America access to the Soviet tanks that America had never seen before. And suddenly, national security people recognize that Israel has potential military advantages as an ally, because you can get access to the Soviet weapons and also see how American weapons work in the field against Soviet weapons. So that would change in the 70s, but in the 50s, Israel was seen as kind of a strategic negative.
So interestingly, I had the great honor of taking the American general and the American defense attaché in Israel to Israeli defense industries to look at those tanks and to see what was going on after 73, which tells you how old I am. But it was really an amazing change in attitude, particularly among the military people. But this leads to a follow-on question. Johnson and Eisenhower, among others, maybe among every American president, have other and maybe bigger fish to fry than Israel policy. There is oil, there is the Soviet Union, there is a lot of stuff out there that is not about Israel. Could you comment on the relative importance of Israel, the relative weight of Israel in these deliberations for an administration, any administration?
I'm not sure I fully get the question. Is it about where does Israel rank as a
priority item? If you're looking at, for example, as Nixon was, Arab oil versus Israel, or Johnson was, Arab states and also oil versus Israel, is there first of all a relationship between those two things, Soviet Union versus Israel, and where is Israel's priority level? Yeah, maybe you just say to yourself, Russians are more important, whatever they want.
So a couple of things. First of all, I think that the kind of basic conflict with the Palestinians is so intractable or unmovable that I think administrations are a little skeptical of going in and thinking they're going to solve it. And even the Obama administration, I don't think they had any real pretensions that they were going to solve the issue. The last administration that really tried was Clinton, and Clinton had that famous discussion with Arafat at the end of his presidency where he says, Arafat says, "You're a great leader," and Clinton says, "No, I'm a failure, and you made me one," because of Arafat's refusal to say yes to many different, very generous Israeli offers. So I think that I don't think even liberal administrations that are more skeptical of Israel come in thinking they're going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. I think the Trump administration saw an opportunity to go in a different direction with the Abraham Accords, which I celebrate, and I think we should all celebrate. I think that's a good thing. But I don't think that was the top priority of the Trump administration. And so I think that I think what you want is from politically, you want to make sure you're kind of appeasing your base, whether it's a conservative base, you're saying we're being supportive of Israel, or liberals, you're saying we're holding their feet to the fire, and you don't want the situation to blow up. And I think that's what these presidents are looking at. What I've heard is that Lincoln and Sullivan, their view is we really don't want to focus on Israel. We're okay with the embassy in Jerusalem. We're not going to make a big deal about Israel in general. We really want to focus on renormalizing relations with the Europeans and also rethinking our relationship with China. And those are the top strategic priorities of the administration. Plus, you've got Kerry doing the climate stuff. So I would not put Israel on the top 5 of what I think the Biden administration is going to be looking at.
Which may be comforting to Israel in some ways and maybe worrisome in other ways. It'll remain to see how it plays out. There is a comment question here from someone who says, "We were in the military during the 6-Day War. Orders came down, quote, from the highest level, quote, that all Jewish officers, non-coms, and enlisted men were encouraged to actively support pro-Israel efforts and the Israel Emergency Fund. This was under Johnson. How do you explain it? Or do you explain it?"
So this person, I guess, was in the U.S. military.
Yes, U.S. military.
Look, I think that there were different forces in the Democratic Party at the time. And the Democratic Party, by the way, in the 60s was the much more pro-Israel party than the Republican Party. And I think that what Johnson was contending was with the general hostility from the rank and file within the national security establishment, but the senior leadership influenced by Johnson was a little more pro-Israel. So I think that Israel was seen as there's a great book by my friend Josh Moravchik, where he talks about turning David into Goliath, and how Israel was seen as the underdog in those days, and now is seen as the kind of the big bad player, certainly in polite circles on the left and in European capitals. So I think that there was a lot of sympathy in the American public, and within the rank and file of the military, and also within the leadership in the political leadership in the White House towards Israel. And I think that's a good thing.
I'm happy to say that Josh Moravchik is also a JPC member of the Board of Fellows, and we have promoted his book. And yes, Making David into Goliath is a great look at the position of Israel over time. And
yeah, let me give an extra plug for that. Look, this is an issue I know well. I read a lot about the subject, and I learned so much from that book. I mean, he took all these incidents that were relatively familiar to me, and he just put it in a whole new frame. And I really urge people to read that book.
So now, everybody, you have 3 books that you need to read. You need 2 by Tevi and 1 by Josh Moravchik. We're coming toward the end, so let me try to squeeze in 2 more. From David Weinberg in Israel, how do you break through the echo chamber? If the Biden team is so cohesive, given that they worked for Obama and probably they will likely be narrowcasting on the same channel, he says, along with the liberal media and liberal think tanks. So how do you get a divergent perspective in there?
It's a great question, and David is a super smart guy, and I'm happy to talk to him offline about how to do this. It's going to be a real problem, David. It is not easy to solve this problem. I see this in my own life in all kinds of ways. There are things that I am aware of because of my reading. Look, John Podhoretz says that conservatives have to be bilingual. Right? We read the New York Times and Washington Post, but we're also aware of what's going on in commentary in the Wall Street Journal and National Review and JPC publications, et cetera. Republicans, conservatives tend to read outside their area things that they disagree with, whereas liberals tend to read liberal publications and they don't go outside their area. So there's all kinds of things that I feel like I'm aware of that I talk to friends who are on the left and they've never heard of them. And so it is hard to break into that bubble. You just have to keep pushing. I mean, David, you write great columns. And the Jerusalem Post is a venue where some people who are not, it's not just read by people on the right. I also try in my own writing. I do my stuff for commentary in the Wall Street Journal, but I also try and write for Politico and the Washington Post and the New York Times when they'll have me. So you really got to push, and you can't just rely on conservative media sources. You've got to be more creative.
So we've come close to the end. I've got one more question, and listeners know that I try to ask a question at the end, the answer to which is positive, because I like to leave things on a positive note. So the questioner has given us a positive question. What is the best case scenario for pro-Israel democratic activity, given the political penalty for ignoring the far left? What's the best case scenario up on the Hill? Even Menendez and Schumer, he says, have abandoned their position opposing the nuclear deal. Now, if you can make a positive response to that, Tevi, that'd be a great thing. What's our best case scenario?
I can and I will. I look at this election results as a repudiation of Trump and a repudiation of the woke left. The Republicans gained seats in the House. They almost held on to the Senate and should have held on to the Senate if not for some world-class stupidity on the part of
we're non-political. We're non-political.
Right, but I'm just saying that if this election is, in my mind, if I'm correct, that it was a repudiation of the woke left and Trump, then you have a scenario, a potential scenario where Republicans have a viable path forward if they can get their act together, and Democrats, for political survival, are going to say, I'm not going to go with Wokey Wokerson here, but let's go with the more moderate members. And I get that Schumer's worried about a primary challenge from AOC, and I get that Menendez was, all these conservatives who kind of celebrated Menendez should have known he wasn't going to be a constant ally. But I think that the Democrats and Republicans try to, or at least the smart politicos, try to look at political reality. And if this woke left and anti-Israel and BLM and defund the police stuff turns voters off, then they're going to have to think about, hey, how can we redo that? How can we rethink that? And one way to rethink it is to have a more measured approach towards Israel. I'm not going to say they're going to be like the evangelicals or even the Trump administration are saying, let's move the embassy to Jerusalem, rah, rah. But they'll have a more measured approach towards Israel. And I think if we have both parties either pro or measured towards Israel, that's a good or at least better place to be.
And that's a great place to stop. American politics, it has been said, is played between the 40-yard lines. And I think for the last 4 years, the 10-yard lines on both sides have been taking up most of the political space. So if we can get back to the 40s, yeah, maybe. So I would like to thank our guest, Tevi Troy, remind everybody to buy his books, and Josh Morav's book, and thank all of you for tuning in and such great questions. Tevi, thank you. I hope we'll see you again.
Thank you very much.